10 minutes. That's all it took for over 9,000 people to die in the Baltic Sea. 9,000 souls lost in a single night of terror. 6 times more than the Titanic. Yet most people have never heard of this disaster. The deadliest maritime tragedy in history. January 30th, 1945. World War II was reaching its bloody conclusion. The Wilhelm Gustloff had once been Germany's pride, a luxury cruise liner for the elite. 663 feet of opulent decks, ballrooms, and dining halls. But by 1945, this floating palace had become something else entirely. A desperate refuge for thousands fleeing the advancing Soviet army. Families crammed into every available space. Children, elderly, wounded soldiers. The ship, designed for 1,900 passengers, now carried over 10,000. What happened that night in the Baltic would become history's greatest maritime disaster. Yet it remained buried beneath decades of silence and shame. Tonight, we uncover the truth behind the tragedy the world chose to forget. If you're finding value in this, hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. January 1945. The Nazi war machine was collapsing, but the real horror was just beginning. Soviet forces were crushing through East Prussia like a steel avalanche. 2.5 million German civilians found themselves trapped. The Red Army's advance meant certain death for anyone left behind. Stories of Soviet brutality had already reached the fleeing masses. In desperation, Nazi command launched Operation Hannibal, the largest maritime evacuation in human history. Every available ship was pressed into service. Cargo vessels, cruise liners, fishing boats. Anything that could float became a lifeline. The Wilhelm Gustloff, that luxury liner we met earlier, was thrust into this chaos. But she wasn't built for this nightmare. Designed for 1,900 passengers in comfort, what happened next defied all logic and safety. Desperate families stormed aboard, mothers clutching infants, pregnant women, children separated from parents in the crushing mob. Wounded soldiers hobbled on crutches. Hospital patients were carried on stretchers. The ship's capacity became a meaningless number. 2,000 became 4,000, then 6,000. Still they came, cramming into every available space. Corridors became sleeping quarters. Dining rooms turned into nurseries. The swimming pool filled with refugees seeking shelter. When the Wilhelm Gustloff finally departed, over 10,000 souls were crammed aboard. More than 5 times. At 9:16 p.m. on January 30th, 1945, Captain Alexander Marinesko of Soviet submarine S-13 made a decision that would seal the fate of 9,000 souls. 3 torpedoes sliced through the icy Baltic waters at deadly speed. The first torpedo struck the Wilhelm Gustloff's port side with devastating force. Within minutes, the massive vessel began listing violently to one side. The ship's lights flickered once, twice, then died completely, plunging 9,000 passengers into absolute darkness. Panic erupted in the overcrowded corridors as thousands of terrified souls fought desperately for escape routes. Families were torn apart in the crushing stampede through narrow stairwells. Children's screams echoed through the tilting ship as they were trampled underfoot by the desperate masses above. On the lower decks, hundreds of passengers found themselves trapped as freezing seawater poured through the gaping torpedo holes. The ship's severe list made launching lifeboats nearly impossible. Those who managed to reach the deck faced the Baltic's killing cold of -18 degrees Celsius. The Wilhelm Gustloff's death throes lasted exactly 45 minutes. Then she was gone, taking with her more souls than any maritime disaster in recorded history. In the pitch-black waters of the Baltic Sea, rescue ships finally arrived at the scene. But they were too late. What they found was a maritime graveyard. Of the 10,400 souls who had boarded the Wilhelm Gustloff, only 1,200 would survive. Over 9,000 people had perished in less than an hour. Among the dead were more than 5,000 children. Entire families wiped out in minutes. The rescue ships pulled mostly corpses from the water, bodies frozen solid by the Baltic's brutal temperature. Those who did survive would carry unimaginable trauma for the rest of their lives. Survivor Helga Reuter watched her mother and sister disappear beneath the waves. She later described hearing the screams fade into an eerie silence as hypothermia claimed its victims. Another survivor, Eva Luck, was just 9 years old when she lost her entire family. While survivors grieved, the Soviet Union celebrated the sinking as a military victory. The Germans, devastated and defeated, remained silent about the catastrophe. 9,000 deaths, more than 4 times the Titanic's toll. Yet somehow this became the maritime disaster that history chose to forget. 9,400 people died in the Baltic Sea that night. So why has history forgotten their names? The answer lies in the cold machinery of politics. When the Iron Curtain fell across Europe, this tragedy fell with it. Germany, defeated and divided, had no desire to commemorate the loss of a ship carrying refugees from the collapsing Reich. The Soviet Union had even less interest. They had sunk the ship. Acknowledging civilian deaths would tarnish their victory narrative. Unlike the Titanic, there were no wealthy American survivors to tell their stories to eager reporters. No Hollywood studios saw profit in the story of German refugees. No famous names had perished in these waters. The survivors who did escape were scattered across a divided world, their testimonies lost in the chaos of rebuilding. For decades, the lessons that should have been learned were ignored. Civilian ships continued sailing through war zones unprotected. Maritime safety protocols remained unchanged. The international community moved on, forgetting the price of negligence. It wasn't until the 1990s that serious efforts began to memorialize the dead. 50 years too late. Today, small plaques and modest monuments mark the tragedy. But 9,000 deaths deserved so much more. History chose its martyrs carefully. The Wilhelm Gustloff and her passengers were not among the chosen. 9,000 souls vanished beneath the waves. Their only crime was being on the wrong side of a war they didn't start. If this opened your eyes to history's